The wind tasted of grit and endings. It blew across the Llano Estacado, the great staked plains, carrying nothing but dust and the rumors of progress. The year was 1878, and the town of Coyote Ford was a raw nerve on the edge of the Texas-New Mexico territory. It shivered in the fading light, a collection of clapboard and canvas huddled against the vast emptiness. Coyote Ford lived by the rhythm of two masters, the cattle drives that pushed north, leaving behind a trail of spent coin and broken glass, and the railroad, a promise of iron salvation that came with its own private army. The men who patrolled for the railroad wore matching hats and carried new model Winchesters. They answered to no local law because, in Coyote Ford, law was a suggestion, a half-forgotten story from back east. Above the saloon and the general store, the small church steeple stood dark. Its bell had not rung in months. It did not ring for births, nor for weddings, and it had remained silent even for the burial of the last town marshal. The silence of the bell was the silence of the town itself, a community held breathless, its throat tight with fear of the men who owned the beef and the men who laid the tracks. Power had a name, and in Coyote Ford, it was not God. In the center of the dusty plaza, baked hard as brick by the day's sun, sat the symbol of the town's paralysis. It was an iron cage, thick bars rusted by the sporadic rains, built not for animals but for men, and inside it, there was a man. He was Comanche. His hair was matted with blood and dirt. He sat on his haunches, refusing to lean against the bars, his dignity a fortress more solid than the iron around him. A gash on his forehead wept blood slowly, carving a clean line through the grime. The townsfolk watched him from the boardwalks, their faces blank or curious or hateful. He was a spectacle, a wild animal captured and displayed. A woman stepped off the boardwalk, her boots making almost no sound in the thick dust. Her name was Ada Whitlock. She was 25 years old, but her eyes held the sober weight of a much longer life. She was a widow, her husband taken not by the war, but by the wasting sickness that followed it. She had come west to teach, to build something new from the ashes of the old, but her skills as a field nurse during Reconstruction were called upon more often than her books. She carried a small leather satchel. Her dress was simple, dark blue, and practical. A few of the men lounging by the saloon whistled, a low, crude sound. But she did not turn her head. She hated injustice with a cold, steady fire, a hatred born when railroad detectives, men just like the ones patrolling Coyote Ford, had framed her father and ruined her family, all for a piece of land they wanted. She knew how to use the pistol she kept in a locked box under her bed, knew how to hit a tin can at 30 paces. But she despised the violence it represented. She believed in mending, not breaking. She stopped in front of the cage. The prisoner's head was bowed. "Water." A man in the small crowd sneered. "He ain't deserving of water." Ada ignored him. She unhooked a canteen from her belt and, finding the gap in the bars, pushed it through. The man inside did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, his hand reached out and took it. "I have bandages," she said, her voice clear and low. "For your head." The prisoner looked up, his black eyes unreadable. He said nothing, but he shifted, turning his head to show her the wound. Ada opened her satchel. She took out a clean cloth, soaked it with water from her second canteen, and began to work, her hands sure and steady as they passed through the bars to clean the wound. From the shadows of the smithy across the plaza, another man watched. His name was Takuma, though most in the town knew him only as Tak. He was Comanche, like the man in the cage. He was 27, tall for his people, with a stillness about him that was often mistaken for slowness. It was not slowness, it was observation. He had been a warrior, a messenger who could ride for 3 days without rest. Now, he was a blacksmith. He mended harness, he fixed saddles, he hammered iron into horseshoes and wagon fittings. His English was functional, learned in the hard school of trade and survival. His hands, broad and scarred, rested on the haft of his hammer. These were the same hands that had once carried a war lance, the same hands that had drawn a bowstring taut. Now they created, they fixed, they built. It was a choice he had made, a promise to the memory of his younger brother, who had died under the rifles of a rail-laying crew, his only crime being in the way of their straight iron line. Tak lived by his word, a promise as binding as blood. He watched the woman, Ada Whitlock. He had seen her before, with the children, her voice patient as she taught them their letters. He had seen her in the general store, arguing with the proprietor over the price of flour for a hungry family. And now he saw her here, tending to a man most others would sooner see hang. She worked with no fear, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the cut. The man in the cage flinched, but she murmured something, a sound too low for Tak to hear, and the man grew still again. Ada finished cleaning the wound and applied a simple bandage. The crowd had grown quiet, watching this strange, bold act of decency. Ada packed her supplies, her movements deliberate. As she turned to leave, her gaze swept the plaza. It moved past the saloon, past the general store, and locked with a shadow standing by the forge. Takuma did not move. He stood half in the light, half in the dark, the fire of the cooling forge glowing behind him. Ada stopped. Her eyes met his. It was not a long look, perhaps only 2 or 3 seconds. But in that small space of time, something profound and silent passed between them. He saw her a woman of stubborn kindness, a single point of light in a town gone dark with fear. He saw the strength in her that went beyond her small frame, a strength he recognized. She saw him not just a blacksmith, not just Tak the Indian. She saw the man watching, his stillness a shield. She saw the coiled strength in his shoulders and the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes, a sorrow that mirrored the wound in her own past. She saw a man who, like her, was an outcast in his own way, caught between worlds. In his eyes, she saw the loss of his brother. In her eyes, he saw the shadow of her ruined family. They stood separated by a dusty plaza, by race, by history. But in that moment, they were the only 2 people in Coyote Ford who truly saw. They saw the storm that was coming. They saw the cage and the man inside it as what it was not, an act of justice. In a place with no justice, but an act of power, a declaration. Ada held his gaze, then gave a single, small nod. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. Takuma inclined his head, just as slightly. Ada turned and walked back to the boardwalk, her back straight, her satchel clutched in her hand. The crowd parted for her, their expressions a mix of confusion and nascent respect. Takuma turned back to his anvil. He picked up the hammer, the weight familiar and comforting. He struck the cooling piece of iron, a ringing sound that cut through the oppressive evening air. The silent church bell offered no reply, but the hammer rang. It was a sound of creation, a sound of defiance. It was the sound of a man building a life, one spark at a time, in the heart of a coming storm. The man in the cage heard it. Ada Whitlock heard it as she stepped into her small schoolhouse, which also served as her clinic. The dust swirled in the plaza as the sun finally died, and the night, cold and dangerous, settled over Coyote Ford. The sun rose on a day that already felt judged. The man in the cage was gone, taken by Broderick's railroad rangers before dawn, his fate unknown and unasked after. The town exhaled, believing the trouble had passed. They were wrong. The trouble had only just found its target. It came in the form of 5 riders, led by Captain Broderick himself. He was a man carved from gristle, with a face burned red by the sun and a gaze that held no warmth. He wore the gray, high-collared coat of a railroad detective, but he moved with the predatory assurance of a wolf. They did not ride to the plaza. They rode straight to the smithy. Takuma was working the bellows, bringing the forge to a white heat for the day's work. He heard the horses stop and the jingle of spurs on his doorstep. He turned, his hands already clean of his hammer, as Broderick filled the doorway, blocking the morning light. "Takuma," Broderick said. The name was a butchery on his tongue. You are under arrest. Two of his rangers stepped in, rifles held ready. Tuck did not move. His face remained calm, his eyes fixed on Broderick. For what? It was not a question but a demand for facts. For the murder of Silas Croft and for cattle rustling. Broderick gestured, and one of his men threw a bundle onto the dirt floor. It was a cowhide, still rank, bearing a fresh brand. Beside it, he dropped a Comanche hunting lance, its iron tip stained with a dark, flaking substance. Croft was found an hour ago, pinned to a cottonwood with this, Broderick said, nudging the lance with his boot. And this hide was found in your lean-to. Tuck's gaze dropped to the hide. He looked at the brand. His expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He knew that brand, and he knew it was not his. This is not mine, he said. Tell it to the town. Broderick sneered. Get him. They held the trial in the plaza, not even bothering with the saloon. It was a declaration of power, meant for all to see. Colonel Whitlaw was present, standing on the boardwalk in front of the land office. He was a man of supposed refinement, in a dark suit and polished boots, but his eyes were the same as Broderick's, cold, assessing, and empty. He was the owner of the railroad patrol, the owner of the bank, and, in effect, the owner of Coyote Ford. Tuck stood before them, his hands bound. He did not look like a prisoner. He looked like a man waiting. Reverend Eldridge was called to give the proceedings a veneer of legitimacy. The minister was a pale, thin man, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. Captain Broderick, Eldridge began, his voice trembling. This is a grave charge. Surely we must wait for... Wait for what? Reverend... Broderick cut him off. For a federal marshal who will not be here for a month. We have a body. We have the culprit. We have the weapon. This territory has laws about summary justice. He pointed to Tuck. This savage killed a white man. He stole cattle. The evidence is plain. It is not plain, a voice said. The crowd parted. Ada Whitlock stepped forward, her face pale but her gaze steady. She was dressed in the same practical blue dress, her hair pinned back tightly. Ma'am, Broderick said, his voice a mockery of politeness. This is men's business. That body is a medical matter, Ada stated. Silas Croft was a patient of mine. I am the only medical authority in this town, and I will examine the body before any justice is carried out. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not part of the script. Whitlaw, from the boardwalk, gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head at Broderick. But it was too late. To deny her would look like a cover-up. Fine, Broderick spat. He is in the wagon. Look all you want. It will not change what that spear did to him. The body was in the back of a buckboard. Ada climbed up, her satchel in hand. She pulled back the stained canvas sheet. Silas Croft was a young ranch hand. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, and in his chest, just as Broderick had said, was a hole. Ada looked at the hole. She opened her satchel and removed a probe. She looked at the edges of the wound. The crowd was silent, watching her. She spent a full 2 minutes examining the body. When she turned around, her face was white with a contained fury. She stepped down from the wagon. She faced Broderick. Captain, she said, her voice carrying in the still, hot air. You are either a liar or a fool. A collective gasp. Broderick's hand dropped to his pistol. This man was not killed by a spear, Ada declared. A spear tears the flesh. It leaves a wide, jagged entry. This wound is small. It is clean, and the tissue around it is burned by powder. She held up her probe. I could not find the bullet. It passed clean through him. But given the size of the entry and exit, I would say this man was shot, at close range, with a .44 caliber Henry rifle. The spear, she said, pointing to the lance on the ground, was put in the hole after he was already dead. Silence. The entire plaza was frozen. Tuck's eyes lifted, and he looked at Ada. He truly looked at her. Broderick was the first to move. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. A female doctor, telling us how a man died. You have a good imagination, ma'am, but you are wrong. Am I? Ada said. Or are you afraid to look, Reverend Eldridge? You have seen men fall in the war. Tell me I am wrong. Eldridge looked from Ada to Broderick, then to Colonel Whitlaw, who was staring at him. The minister shrank, his gaze falling to the dust. I am not a doctor. I cannot say. He cannot say. Broderick grinned. He stepped toward Ada, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. But I can. I say you are interfering. I say you are a Comanche lover. And I say a schoolhouse and a small clinic are made of very, very dry wood. It would be a tragedy if a spark, from a forge, perhaps, were to catch it. The threat hung in the air, choking all protest. The townsfolk, who had for a moment looked ready to question, now looked at their boots. They turned away from Ada, one by one. She was alone. Ada looked at the hostile faces, at the frightened minister, at the cold eyes of Whitlaw, and at the bound man, Takuma. She saw her father's ruin in this moment. She saw the land stolen, the name slandered, and a cold, hard resolve settled in her. She would not let it happen again. She took a deep breath. You will not hang him, Captain. And who will stop me? The law, Ada said. Broderick laughed again. I am the law today. No, Ada said. You are not. This town, this territory, falls under the Federal Reconstruction and Medical Charter of 1868. I have a copy in my clinic. It states that in a territory without a standing judiciary, essential medical personnel are protected. It also states that they have the right to procure and retain skilled assistants necessary for their duties. She pointed a finger, not at Broderick, but at Takuma. This man is the only skilled metal worker in Coyote Ford. My medical instruments, my scalpels, my forceps, my probes, are in constant need of repair and sharpening. It is a specialized skill. He is my essential assistant. She looked at Broderick, her eyes blazing. I am officially under territorial charter, claiming him as my medical auxiliary assistant. He is bonded to my service and to this town's health until a federal circuit judge arrives to review the case. If you hang him, you are violating federal law, and I will see you and Colonel Whitlaw tried for it. It was a bluff, a magnificent, desperate, and brilliant bluff. The charter might or might not hold water, but the mention of a federal judge and the direct naming of Colonel Whitlaw had changed the game. Broderick was speechless. He looked to Whitlaw for guidance. Whitlaw stepped off the boardwalk. He appraised Ada, a flicker of something like respect in his cold eyes. A bold move, Mrs. Whitlock, he said, his voice smooth. Very well. The captain, as a representative of the railroad, is a firm believer in the law. He smiled, a reptilian gesture. The man is yours. He is bonded to you. But a bond has two ends. If he flees, if he violates your custody in any way, if he has seen so much as a foot outside your property without you, he will be shot on sight. And you, he added, will be charged as an accomplice to murder. He turned to Broderick. Cut him loose. Give him to the lady. Broderick's face was dark with rage. He sliced Tuck's bonds with his knife. You are on a short rope, both of you. Tuck rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving Ada. He understood exactly what she had done. She had saved his life, but she had chained herself to him in the process. That afternoon, in the silence of her small clinic, Ada examined the evidence Broderick had left behind. The lance was a cheap imitation, but the hide was interesting. She spread it on her examination table. The brand was a WC for Whitlaw cattle, but it was sloppy. The burn was too deep, the edges blurred. She scraped at it with her fingernail, and underneath, she saw it, a faint, older, much more elegant brand, a simple SC, Silas Croft. They had not even bothered to steal a hide. They had taken Croft's own and branded over it. It was a killer's arrogance, a method of stealing land and cattle in plain sight. She was washing the grime and blood from her hands when Takuma spoke. He had been standing by the door, silent, for the past hour. You should not have done this, he said. Ada dried her hands. They were going to murder you. They will not stop, he said. Now they will come for two. We will see. She turned to face him. You heard the terms. You cannot leave. You will stay here, in the cot by the schoolroom. He shook his head. No. What? Ada was taken aback. I just saved your life. You must. I will not sleep in your house, he said. He said it not with anger, but with a flat finality. It is not right. He stepped out onto the small porch, sat on the steps, and leaned his back against the post. He would be the guard. You do not understand, Ada said, following him to the doorway. They will shoot you if you are. I am on your property, he said, indicating the porch step. I will not eat at your table. I will not sleep under your roof. I am here. This is the line. He was respecting a boundary she had not even known existed, a cultural divide. He was in her custody, but he would not be her guest. Ada felt a surge of frustration, then a slow understanding. This was his own code. Later, as dusk fell, he was still there. Ada brought him a plate of stew. He looked at it, then at her. He took the plate, but he did not eat. He held out his hand. On his left thumbnail, there was a streak of faded red paint, almost like dried blood. It was ochre. In my grandfather's time, Takuma said, his voice low. A warrior who was saved in battle gave a promise. This, he touched the red mark, is the sign of the promise. I cannot run. I will not, and I will protect the one who holds my life. He met her eyes. They will come, and I will be ready. The fragile trust was there, as sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass. As night fell, Ada looked out her window. Across the plaza, leaning against the saloon, was one of Broderick's rangers. He was smoking a cigarette, the red ember glowing in the dark. He was watching her clinic. She turned from the window. Takuma was still on the porch, a silent, unmoving shadow. He saw the ranger too. He has been there for 1 hour, Takuma said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. The pressure was already beginning. The rope was short, just as Broderick had promised. The first night passed in a tense, shared silence. Takuma did not sleep. He sat on the porch step, a living statue, watching the ranger across the plaza. The ranger watched him. It was a war of stillness. Ada slept fitfully, the pistol she hated now on her nightstand, loaded. The morning brought a small, strange gift. A boy, one of the merchant's sons, ran past the clinic and tossed a wadded piece of paper onto the porch. It was not meant for Tak. It was addressed to Ada. Tak picked it up, his movements fluid, and handed it to her when she emerged with a cup of coffee she did not want. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was educated, sharp, and hurried. There was no signature. It read, Cousin Ada, stop. You are meddling in things that will bury you. He is a spider, and his web is the county line. He has already had the survey maps in the county record office changed. The grant lines for the new spur are now conveniently drawn across land, including crofts that did not belong to him before last week. This is not about one man. It is about the entire valley. Burn this. Get out. Ada's blood ran cold. She knew the handwriting. Samuel. Her cousin. Samuel Whitlock. A man she had not seen since before the war. A man who had always chosen the path of least resistance, which had apparently led him to become a lawyer for Colonel Whitlaw. He was warning her, but he was also confirming her darkest suspicion. This was bigger than a single murder. It was a systematic theft of the land itself. She looked at Tuck, who was watching her face. She did not need to explain. He saw the grim set of her jaw. More trouble, he stated. Yes, she said, folding the note. She would not burn it. More trouble and more proof. That night, the second night, the watching ranger was gone. The plaza was quiet. Too quiet. A heavy, moonless dark settled over Coyote Ford. Ada was inside, reviewing her medical ledger. Tak was on the porch, his senses stretched taut. He smelled it first, not wood smoke, kerosene. He stood up just as the first flicker of orange light bloomed from under the clinic's side wall. "Ada!" he roared, not with his voice but with his chest. He kicked the clinic door open, splintering the frame. The front room was already filling with thick, acrid smoke. "Fire!" he bellowed, a warning to the sleeping town. Ada was standing in the middle of the room, disoriented, clutching her ledger. Flames were already licking up the wall where her desk stood. "Out!" Tak commanded, grabbing her arm. "My satchel." She choked, pointing to the back room. "My medicines." "No. Life first." He did not wait for her to argue. He was a man of swift, decisive action. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing. One arm hooked under her knees, the other around her back, her ledger pressed between them. He plunged back through the doorway, shielding her body with his own as a wave of heat followed them. He set her down in the dust of the plaza, a safe distance away. The clinic was already an inferno, the dry wood catching with terrifying speed. People were emerging from their homes, shadows in the sudden, hellish light. Ada was coughing, her eyes streaming. "The ledger!" she gasped, looking down at her hands. She was still clutching it. She had saved the one thing that mattered most. Her book of records, her proof. In it, carefully noted, was the time she had treated Silas Croft for a whiskey brawl, just 6 hours before Broderick claimed he was rustling cattle on the other side of the county. The alibi Whitlaw had provided for his own men now lay in ashes. But her timeline was safe. Takuma turned back to the fire. He grabbed a horse trough blanket, soaked it in water, and went back, not to the clinic, but to the schoolhouse attached to it. The flames were spreading. He fought the fire with a silent, focused fury, beating at the greedy edges. When the town's meager bucket brigade finally formed, Tak was the center of it, a soot-covered, bare-chested demon battling the flames. He saved the schoolhouse. The clinic, however, was gone. As dawn broke, Ada stood looking at the smoking ruin. Her home, her clinic, her small place of order, was a pile of wet charcoal. Takuma walked out of the smoke. He was uninjured, but his hands were raw. He walked to the one remaining wall of the clinic, a section of the chimney stack, and leaned his hand against it to catch his breath. When he pulled his hand away, he left a perfect, stark black handprint in the gray soot. He looked at the print. It was a sign, a hand of rescue. He turned to Ada, who was watching him, her face smudged, her dress ruined. "Now," he said, his voice a low rasp, "we have no house. We are free to move." It was not a lament. It was a tactical assessment. The town's reaction was predictable. In the light of day, several people came by. Mrs. Prentice, the baker's wife, left a small parcel on the steps of the surviving schoolhouse. Inside was a loaf of bread and a canteen of fresh water. Old Man Hemphill, the livery owner, walked by and tossed a sack of oats onto the porch, muttering something about "feed for the horse you do not have." They were acts of kindness. They were also acts of fear. No one would meet her eye. No one would offer them shelter. To stand with Ada and Tak was to stand in the path of the fire. Ada took the bread and water. "They are afraid," she murmured. "Fear is a wall." Tak said, "We go around." He was already examining the ground, not the ashes. He knelt by the side of the ruin where the arsonist had stood. The ground was hard, but he found what he was looking for. A single, clear horseshoe print, pressed into the earth where the man had mounted his horse to ride away. Tak studied it. He ran his fingers along the impression. "What is it?" Ada asked. "Whitlaw's Drive," he said. "This shoe is set with a W star, but that is not what I see." He pointed to the impressions left by the nails. 4 on this side, 3 on this side, and this one. He touched a specific point. "Is angled. This is not factory work. This is one man's habit. A blacksmith knows another man's hand by his nails. This horse was shod by the man at the railroad camp." He stood up. "This is the proof. The man who burned your house rides for Whitlaw." He now had a direct line of investigation. But Broderick was not a man to wait. He knew his attack had failed in its primary purpose to kill them or drive them out. So he changed tactics. He aimed at Ada's heart. Her name was Lina. She was a young Navajo girl, perhaps 10 years old, whose family had been scattered. She lived with the minister and his wife, and she was Ada's brightest student. She was quiet, observant, and she adored Ada. That afternoon, Lina did not appear for her lessons, which Ada had resolved to hold on the steps of the burned-out clinic. "She is always on time," Ada said, a knot of fresh anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Where does she live?" Tuck asked. They found Reverend Eldridge wringing his hands on the steps of the church. "They took her," he whispered, his face ashen. "Captain Broderick and his men, they said it was for her own protection, that you were a danger. They took her to the railroad camp." The message was brutally clear. "Stop, or the child will be hurt." "This is not his fight," Ada said, her voice shaking with a rage so cold it frightened her. "He will not use a child." "He is," Tuck said simply. He was already walking toward the livery. "What are you doing?" Ada ran to catch up. "I am getting a horse. You are staying here." "No," Ada said. "She is my student. I am coming with you. You are a target. I am her shield. I am coming." Tuck looked at her, at the small, determined woman standing in the ruins of her life, ready to walk into the lion's den for a child. His respect for her deepened, settling into something hard and permanent. "Then come," he said. "But we do not go as fighters. We go as law." He did not go to the livery. He went to the telegraph office. The operator, a nervous young man named Finney, looked up in alarm. "Tech, you cannot be in here. Mrs. Whitlock. Colonel Whitlaw owns this line." "We know," Ada said. "We need to send a message to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe." "I cannot," Finney stammered. "They will know. They read all the tapes." "Good," Tuck said, his presence filling the small room. He laid a silver dollar on the counter. "You will send this message, and you will tell anyone who asks that you sent this message." He dictated, and Ada corrected the English. "To Marshal Rios, Santa Fe, stop. Evidence of murder and land fraud found in Coyote Ford. Stop. Silas Croft murdered by gunshot, not spear. Stop. Medical records and forged brand prove conspiracy. Stop. Federal witness Takuma and guardian Ada Whitlock under threat. Stop. Minor child Lina, Navajo, taken by Broderick's railroad rangers. Stop. Request immediate federal presence. Stop." Finney's hands were shaking as he tapped the key. The message clicked out, a series of desperate sparks into the vast wire. When he was done, he slumped, pale. "They will have my job, or my hide. You did the right thing," Ada said, placing her hand on his arm. "That," Finney said, "does not matter much out here." They were walking back to the schoolhouse when the return signal began to click. Finney waved them back inside, his eyes wide. He scribbled on a pad as the message came in. He tore it off and handed it to Ada. Arriving, it read, 3 days. Hold fast. Rios. Ada's knees felt weak. She leaned against the door frame. 3 days. 72 hours. She looked at Tuck. He was looking at the paper, his face grim. 72 hours, Ada said. "He will not wait," Tuck said, his gaze shifting to the railroad camp. A plume of smoke on the horizon. "Broderick will not wait for a marshal. He has the child. He will force our hand." "Then we do not wait," Ada said, her voice hardening. "We go get her. We have 72 hours to find the truth, and our first act is to bring that child home." The countdown had begun. It was not a race for justice. It was a race for survival. They did not have 72 hours. They had the time it took for Broderick to realize his arson had failed. They had the time it took for him to act on the threat he had made. The rescue of Lina was not a choice. It was the only thing. But they could not ride into the railroad camp. 2 people against 20. Suicide was not rescue. "He wants us," Takuma said. his voice quiet as they stood by the smoking ruins of the clinic. "He uses the child to draw us out. We go, we die. The child, she is lost. If we stay, we die. She is lost." "So what do we do?" Ada's voice was raw. "We find the other path, the one he does not see." Tak looked at the ground, at the horseshoe print left by the arsonist. "He thinks his fire set us back. He is wrong. He gave us a trail. The man who holds the child is at the end of this trail." They left under the cover of a starless sky. To be seen on the porch was a violation of the bond. To leave the town entirely was an act of open war. They were fugitives now, bound only to each other in the desperate timeline. Tak rode a horse borrowed from the livery. A silent promise to old man Hemphill he would return it. Tak did not follow the main road. He moved through the darkness like a spirit, Ada following in his wake. He was not tracking the child. He was tracking the man who burned the clinic, the man with the distinctive horseshoe nails. The trail was cold, but the land held the story. It led them miles north to a place of utter desolation and abandoned water pump, its windmill creaking a high, lonely complaint in the wind. The tracks of the single rider were joined by many others. This was a meeting place. "They gather here," Tak said, dismounting. Ada looked around. "There is nothing here." "There is water," Tak said. He pointed. Tucked against the broken cistern was a new, half-hidden coil of barbed wire. It was freshly spooled, the barbs gleaming. "Wire," Ada said, confused. "The fence," Tak said. He touched one of the barbs. "This is how they steal. They do not drive the cattle. They drive the men. They find the water. Like this. They fence it off. The cattle on the other side. Croft's cattle die of thirst, or..." He pointed to the south. "They must go to the only other water, on Whitlaw's land, and he claims them. This is the rustling. This is the murder." It was a cold, systematic strangulation of the land. As the truth settled over them, the sky itself seemed to change. The wind died. The air turned a sick, sulphurous yellow. Tak looked at the horizon, his face tightening. "Get on the horse! What is it?" "A storm. A sandstorm. Now!" The words were barely out of his mouth when the first gust hit. A physical blow of grit and fury. The sky was erased, replaced by a roaring wall of brown. "Takuma!" Ada screamed, blinded. He was suddenly there, his hand on her reins, pulling her. He was not in a panic. He was focused. "Breathe through the cloth. Keep your head down. Follow." He did not ride against the storm. He rode with it, cutting at an angle, letting the wind itself mask their trail. He was moving on a knowledge older than maps, a feel for the land's unseen contours. He led her into a narrow cut, a dry riverbed she had not even seen, an arroyo. Just as the world above them became a solid, screaming dark, they were in the gully's quiet heart. The wind howled over the rim, but down here, there was an almost unearthly calm. They huddled behind a bend in the arroyo, the horses trembling. For an hour, the sky fell. When the wind finally subsided, the world was new, scoured clean and bathed in a weak, dusty light. "We must go," Ada said, her throat raw. "We wait," Tak said. "The air is not clean." It was then they heard it, a human sound, a man, coughing. Tak was on his feet in an instant, a knife in his hand. He moved around the bend, Ada close behind him. They were not alone. 3 large wagons, the classic prairie schooner style, were jammed into the arroyo. They had clearly sought shelter here, but one had shattered a wheel against the rocks. A group of people, perhaps a dozen, were clustered around it, their faces streaked with dust. They were speaking German. A man with a large, square beard looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. Ada stepped forward, her hands raised. "We mean no harm. We are travelers." The man, who introduced himself as Herman, was wary, but their plight was desperate. A woman in the back of one wagon was in fever, and a boy had a deep gash on his arm. Ada went to work. This was her ground, her purpose. She cleaned the cut, her hands steady, her voice soothing the frightened child. She assessed the woman. It was laudanum poisoning, an accidental overdose in the panic of the storm. Ada knew how to manage it. While she worked, Tak approached the broken wagon. He spoke no German, and they no Comanche, but they spoke the common language of broken wood and iron. He looked at the splintered wheel, at the cracked axle. He ran his scarred blacksmith's hands over the damage. Then, with a series of gestures, he took charge. He used the German's tools, his own file, and scavenged wood from a dead tree in the arroyo, bracing the axle and binding the wheel. It was not a permanent fix, but it would hold. It would get them to town. The Germans were overcome with gratitude. As Ada emerged from the wagon, the woman sleeping peacefully, Herman offered them bread, coffee, and a quiet thanks. A younger man. Carl approached them, his face bright with enthusiasm despite the dust. He carried a large, bulky box. "You are good," he said, in thick, halting English. "We are, thank you." He pointed to his box. "Photography," he said. "The truth, with light." He wanted to show them his work. He pulled out several heavy glass plates. "The new land," he said, holding one up. "Beautiful, lonely." Ada took the plate. She was about to politely hand it back when her breath caught. She gripped Tak's arm. The photograph was of the water pump, the lonely windmill. It was the same one they had just left, and in the background, unmistakable, was Colonel Whitlaw's fine black carriage. Standing beside it, deep in conversation with another man, was Captain Broderick. "When?" Ada's voice was a whisper. "When did you take this?" Carl pointed to the sun and held up 2 fingers. 2 days, 2 days ago, before the storm. This was it. Broderick and Whitlaw. At the scene of the land theft, at the same time Silas Croft was being murdered. It was the link. It was the proof. "Carl," Ada said, This is life. This is the truth. We must have this." Carl, seeing the desperation in her eyes, did not hesitate. He gave her the plate. He pressed his spare, smaller box camera into her hands. "For the kindness," he said. "For the life you take." As the immigrants prepared to move, Ada and Tak sat for a moment by their small, shared fire, the shared danger. The act of rescue had forged a new silence between them. "Takuma," Ada said, trying the name. "What does it mean?" He looked into the flames. "It means, he who keeps the fire." He poked the embers. "The white man sees fire and thinks of burning," he said, gesturing to the memory of her clinic. "Of war. My people. We see the hearth, the fire in the center, the toman. The hearth circle," he said, drawing a circle in the dirt. "This is the family. This is the promise. The fire is where the family is whole, where they are safe." Ada listened, and her hand moved, as if by its own will, to the chain around her neck. Her fingers found the cold, familiar band of her wedding ring. She had thought her hearth was ashes, her fire dead. This man spoke of a fire as a promise. She was terrified of the hope he offered, terrified of being burned again. Tak saw the gesture. He saw the ring. He looked at his own hand, at the red ochre stain on his thumbnail. The warrior's promise. The promise that had, until now, only meant blood. He wanted the hearth. He feared he was only the fire that destroys. Their moment of shared, frightened peace was shattered. A man, one Ada had barely noticed, a quiet man who had stood apart from the Germans, suddenly moved. He was not German. His face was the hard, sunburnt face of a railroad man. He lunged, not at Tak, but at Ada. He was not trying to harm her. He was after the leather ledger she carried, the book she had saved from the fire. He ripped the satchel from her shoulder, the strap breaking. "No!" Ada screamed. Tak was moving, a lethal blur, but the man was already on a horse, a fast pinto hidden in the rocks. He spurred the horse, scrambling up the steep side of the arroyo. Tak did not hesitate. He grabbed a heavy iron file from his tool roll and threw it, side-armed, with a lifetime of practiced strength. The file spun, a silver arc, and struck the ranger square in the back, drawing a grunt of pain. It did not stop him. The man disappeared over the rim. The ledger, with Silas Croft's alibi, was gone. Ada fell to her knees. "It's gone! He took it! All that proof! It's gone!" Tuck stood, breathing hard, his face a mask of cold fury. He walked to her. "He has the book," Takuma said, his voice a low growl. He held up the glass plate. "We have the light." He pulled her to her feet. "Come, the fight has changed." They rode, not to the railroad camp, but to Coyote Ford. The telegraph office was dark, but they roused Finney from his sleep. Ada, her mind racing, knew she could not ask for the alibi page she had already sent. She had to trust Rios had it. She had to attack from the other side, the side her cousin Samuel had revealed. She scribbled on a pad, "To Federal Land Office, Santa Fe, copy to Marshal Rios, stop, requesting immediate confirmation, original 1870 survey map, Llano Estacado, Section 4, compare to new 1878 map filed by Coyote Ford County Registrar." "Stop!" "Suspect fraudulent survey. Urgent. Ada Whitlock." Finney's key clicked. A desperate prayer in the dark. They waited an hour. The line clicked back. Finney translated, his hands shaking. It was from Rios. "Message received. Land Office confirms fraudulent survey. Original map secured my office. Stop. Your first wire. With Croft's alibi. Also secured. Stop. The ledger is paper. The truth is iron. Hold fast. I'm coming. 3 days." Ada leaned against the wall. A wave of relief so strong it almost buckled her knees. She had sent a copy. In her panic after the fire, she had telegraphed the entire page of her ledger. And in the chaos, she had forgotten. They had lost the original book, but Broderick did not know they had the law. He did not know they had the photograph. They stepped out into the pre-dawn light. They had less than 72 hours. "He thinks he disarmed us," Ada said. She looked at the small, square box camera in her hands. "But he just taught us how to fight." "He has the paper." Tuck said, "We have the truth. We will make our own proof. Proof that cannot be burned." They had the truth, but the truth was not a weapon. It was a map. They still had to walk the path, and the path was lined with knives. They had less than 2 days. Marshal Rios was a promise, but a promise on a wire was not a man with a gun. Ada moved first. She put on her last clean dress, a gray wool, and brushed the soot from her hair as best she could. She walked not to the ruins of her clinic, but to the one building in town that was more powerful than the church, the Land and Rail Office, which was Colonel Whitlaw's personal domain. Tuck had wanted to go with her. She had forbidden it. "You are a target," she said, using his own words against him. "I am a grieving widow, asking for charity. It is the one disguise I can wear that they will believe." She found Whitlaw inside, seated behind a mahogany desk that had come, at great expense, from the east. He was looking over a map. The new, false map. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, rising. He was a man of perfect, cold courtesy. "A tragedy. What happened to your clinic? A terrible, terrible accident." "It was Colonel," Ada said, her voice steady. She did not let her hands tremble. "And it has left the children of this town with no school. I came to ask, to beg, if you, as the town's leading citizen, would consider a donation to help rebuild." She was playing the part she despised, the helpless female. Whitlaw's eyes appraised her. He saw a nuisance, but a small one, a gnat. To deny her would look churlish. To grant her a small sum would reinforce his image as a benefactor. "Of course," he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "The railroad is a great believer in education. We will contribute $20 to your fund." He pulled a piece of paper toward him, a formal bank receipt. He dipped his pen in a heavy glass inkwell. "Just so my accountants in Santa Fe are satisfied." "Thank you, Colonel," Ada said, her heart hammering. "But the people are so frightened. If you could sign my own receipt book, it would show the town's faith is restored." She produced a small, cheap receipt book from her reticule. It was a gamble. He paused, His pen, loaded with his own dark, proprietary ink, hovered. He looked at her. She looked back, her face a mask of humble gratitude. He smiled, a thin, dry gesture. "As you wish, Mrs. Whitlock." He signed his name, Colonel A. Whitlaw, with a flourish. In her book, "May God bless you, sir." Ada said. She took the book, the ink still wet. "He will, madam," Whitlaw said. "He will." Ada walked out into the sunlight. She had his signature. She had the ink, the same ink. She was willing to bet her life. That was on the fraudulent county ledger. That night, Takuma moved. He was not a blacksmith. He was not a bonded assistant. He was, for these hours, what he had been before a shadow, a warrior. He moved along the creek bed, past the sleeping houses, until he reached the high fence of Whitlaw's cattle operation. The stables were dark. He slipped over the back fence, landing without a sound in the hay. The air was warm with the smell of horses and linseed oil. He moved to the nearest stall. He did not need light. He used his hands. He ran his fingers over the hoof of a large roan. The horse's shod hoof. He felt the nails. They were standard. He moved to the next stall, and the next. These were ranch horses, replaceable. Then he found the separate stable, where the fine saddle horses were kept. Broderick's pinto, Whitlaw's black gelding. He knelt by the pinto's hoof. He ran his fingers over the nails, and he found it. The W star, a custom nailhead, the mark of Whitlaw's personal blacksmith, a mark of arrogance, a mark he had last seen in the dirt by Ada's burned clinic. He had his proof. "Do not move." The voice was soft, educated. A shotgun clicked in the dark. Tak froze. He did not turn. A man stepped out of the tack room, holding a lantern. The light illuminated a pale, worried face. A man in a fine suit. A man who looked terribly out of place. It was Samuel Whitlock, Ada's cousin. "Turn around, slowly," Samuel said. His hands were shaking. Tak rose, his hands open, and turned. Samuel's eyes widened. You are the one, the Comanche." "I am," Tak said. "They will hang you," Samuel whispered. "What are you doing here?" "Finding this," Tak said. He held up his hand. His thumb pressed against the head of one of the W-star nails, leaving an impression in his skin. Samuel looked at the nail, and his face, already pale, turned the color of ash. He understood. You are with Ada," Samuel said. "I am." "Oh, God!" Samuel breathed. He looked around, terrified. "You must go. He will kill us all." "Who?" "Whitlaw. Broderick." Samuel's voice was a desperate hiss. He is cleaning up. He thinks I know too much. He is right, I do." "What do you know?" Tak's voice was a blade in the dark. Samuel's composure broke. "I saw it. I was there. I was checking the land deeds for Whitlaw. At the pump. Broderick met Croft there. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Broderick shot him in the back. Shot him. Then he took that spear, the one they had for evidence. And he... Samuel gagged, turning his head. "And you said nothing," Tak said. The words were heavy with contempt. "What could I do?" Samuel cried, his voice cracking. "They would kill me. They will kill me. I am a witness. You are a coward." Tak said. "Yes," Samuel hissed. "Yes, I am, but I am not a murderer, and I will not let you be one. Go, get Ada, get out of this territory. You cannot win. You cannot fight an entire railroad." "We are not fighting the railroad," Tak said. "We are fighting a man." He started to move past Samuel. "Wait," Samuel said. He grabbed Tak's arm. He thinks the ledger you stole is the only proof, the man you hit in the arroyo. He told Broderick, they are angry. They are unhinged. They are watching. They are watching the bridge." It was a warning. A sudden, unexpected act of courage from a terrified man. "Go," Samuel whispered. lowering the shotgun. "Go now. Do not use the bridge." Tak looked at him. A long, assessing moment. He saw the fear, but he also saw the small, desperate seed of the man Ada had known. Tak nodded. Once, and he was gone, melting back into the shadows he had come from. He did not heed the warning. To go around the bridge would take an hour. The town was waking, and the bridge was the most direct path to the ruins of the clinic, where Ada was waiting, where they had made their new, grim camp. He would cross. He would be fast. He was not fast enough. The bridge was a narrow, wooden span over the dry creek bed, just at the edge of town. He stepped onto the planks, the sound echoing in the pre-dawn gray. He heard the whistle, a bird call, but not a bird. 2 men stepped from the shadows onto the bridge, 1 on each side. "Railroad men, Broderick's men. This is the end of your bond, savage," one snarled. Tak did not reach for his knife. He launched himself forward, at the man in front of him, aiming to break the line and run. He hit the man with his shoulder, sending him sprawling. He was past him. He never saw the third man. The man who had been hiding on the bank lunged, not with a gun, but with a long, thin blade, a skinning knife. Tak felt a blinding, white-hot fire in his side, a punch so deep it took his breath. He stumbled, his hand flying to the wound. He looked down. The hilt of the knife was protruding from his ribs. He heard shouting. He heard Ada's voice, screaming his name. She had been watching for him. The men faded back into the dark. Their job done. He was on his knees. The world was tilting, the gray light turning to black. He saw Ada running toward him, her face a pale oval of terror. "No," he grunted, forcing the words out. "Ada, stay. Back." He fell, not forward, but sideways, off the bridge, crashing 10 feet into the soft sand of the dry creek bed. It was the last conscious act of a warrior, an act of self-preservation. He fell to hide. She found him by the trail of his blood. He was alive. Barely. "Takuma," she sobbed, tearing at her dress to make a bandage. "The knife," he gasped. "In." She saw it. The handle was still there, buried to the hilt in his side. It had to come out. "We must move you," she said. "No, here." He knew. To move him was to kill him. Ada looked around, frantic. There was no clinic, no tools, no light. "My satchel," she said, her mind snapping into the cold focus of a field nurse. She had her small, remaining kit. She had carbolic. She had sutures, but she had nothing to pull the blade. "In my pocket." Tak breathed. He was fading. She fumbled at his belt. Tucked inside was his blacksmithing roll. She opened it. Files, tongs, small hammers. She grabbed a pair of long, narrow tongs. They were for holding hot metal. "No fire," she whispered, her hands shaking. "No fire to clean them." "Whiskey," he whispered. "In your satchel." She had a small flask. For cleaning wounds, she had told herself, but it was for the shaking. She poured the alcohol over the steel tongs, the liquor washing the grime away. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice the voice of a surgeon. "This will be pain." She gripped the hilt of the knife with the tongs, bracing her foot against his hip. He cried out, a raw, inhuman sound. As she pulled, the blade came free with a sickening sound. Blood, dark and heavy, followed it. She threw the knife away and pressed her hands, her entire body, onto the wound, trying to staunch the flow. "Stay with me, Tak," she pleaded. "Stay with me." She worked for an hour in the half-light, her hands covered in his blood, suturing the wound with the deft, practiced motions of a woman who had seen too much. When she was done, he was unconscious, but he was breathing. His life was in her hands, balanced on the thread she had sewn. She sat back, her body trembling, covered in his blood. She had saved him. She found his small pouch of red ochre. It had fallen from his pocket. She looked at his left hand, at the thumbnail. The old promise faded and now stained with his own blood. With a shaking, deliberate hand, Ada opened the pouch. She mixed the ochre with a few drops of water from her canteen. She knelt beside him. She took his hand. It was cold. She carefully washed the blood from his thumbnail. And then, with the tip of her smallest finger, she painted the red mark back on. It was a bright, vivid streak of color in the gray dawn. "I am with your oath," she whispered. "I hold your life. You will not die." Later that day, he woke. He was in the shadow of the bridge. Ada was beside him, a rifle across her lap. He looked at his hand. He saw the fresh, red mark. He looked at her. Her face was streaked with dirt and his dried blood. He did not speak. He reached into his tool roll and pulled out a file. He handed it to her. Then he pulled out the small W-star horseshoe nail he had taken from the stable. "Proof," he whispered. "I know," she said. "Rest." "No," Tak said. He struggled to sit up, a gasp of pain. "We make the proof." He could not go to his forge. It was too far, and it was watched. He looked at the small, dead campfire Ada had made to boil water. "Fire," he said. He took the file. He took a piece of scrap iron from his roll. And there, in the dry creek bed, wounded and hunted, Takuma the blacksmith began to work. He was not making a weapon. He was making a die. He was forging a stamp. He was forging, shaping the iron, filing the W and the star into its face. Each movement sent a jolt of pain through his side. But he did not stop. Ada watched, her heart aching. He was not just a blacksmith. He was he who keeps the fire. He worked as the sun set. He was forging the final, unassailable piece of their evidence, the tool that made the mark that made the proof. When he was finished, he held it up. It was a crude, small thing, but it was perfect. It was the twin to the tool in Whitlaw's smithy. "Tomorrow," Tak said, his voice a rasp. "Rios comes. We will be ready." Ada said. She looked at their evidence. Laid out on a cloth, a glass photograph, a signed receipt, a small, hand-forged piece of iron, and a single, custom-made nail. It was not much, but it was the truth. The morning of the third day broke, not with hope, but with a hard, metallic light. Marshal Rios arrived on a lathered horse, a single, grim-faced man who looked as if he was carved from the same rock as the high plains. He was not a savior. He was a professional. He followed Ada's directions to the creek bed under the bridge, his face giving nothing away. He found them there. Takuma was sitting, his back braced against the sandy bank, his face pale and slick with sweat. His side was a mass of fresh, dark bandages. Ada sat beside him, the German's camera box on her lap. Rios dismounted. "Mrs. Whitlock." "Yes, Marshal Rios." He nodded, not offering a hand. He looked at Tak. "This is the man." "Takuma." "He is. You are wounded." "I am alive," Tak rasped. "Show me," Rios said. Ada laid out their small, desperate collection of evidence on a saddle blanket, the glass plate photograph, the receipt book with Whitlaw's signature, the W-star nail, and the hand-forged die Tak had made in the fire. Rios knelt. He picked up the die, testing its weight. He compared it to the nail. He looked at the photograph for a long, silent minute. He read the receipt. Finally, he looked at the two of them, huddled in the dirt, bloody and exhausted. "My office received your 2 telegrams," he said. "The land office confirms. The survey is fraudulent. Your medical alibi for this man, Mrs. Whitlock, is a legal, sworn affidavit." He stood up, brushing the sand from his knees. "I have enough paper to hang a man. This," he gestured to their collection, "is the rope." He walked to his horse, pulled his Winchester from its scabbard, and walked. Not to the land office, but to the silent church. He did not knock. He walked in, his spurs ringing on the wood floor. Reverend Eldridge was on his knees, praying. "Reverend," Rios said. Eldridge jumped, his face pale. "You are going to ring that bell." "Reverend," Rios said, his voice quiet but as hard as iron. "You are going to ring it until every man, woman, and child in Coyote Ford is in that plaza. This town is going to have a meeting, or by God, It is going to have a federal indictment for conspiracy." Eldridge stared, his mouth open. "Now." Rios commanded. For the first time in months, the heavy iron bell in the steeple began to toll. It was a rusty, clanging sound, hesitant at first, then stronger. It was the sound of a heart starting to beat. The townspeople emerged, confused, shading their eyes. They gathered in the plaza, drawn by the sound they thought they had forgotten. Colonel Whitlaw came, standing on the boardwalk of his office, a look of profound irritation on his face. Captain Broderick joined him, his hand on his pistol, grinning as he saw the small, frightened crowd. Then they saw Marshal Rios, a stranger with a badge and a rifle, standing on the steps of the church. "My name is Marshal Rios," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I am here on the authority of the United States Federal Court. I am here to investigate the murder of Silas Croft." A cold silence fell. "And I am here," he continued, "to arrest the man who did it." From the side of the church, Ada Whitlock emerged. She was not alone. Takuma was with her, his hand on her shoulder, using her for balance. He was weak, but he was standing. The German immigrants, their wagons fixed, stood with them. The town gasped. Takuma was supposed to be dead. "You!" Broderick snarled, taking a step forward. "You!" Rios snapped back. "Will be silent." Rios turned to the crowd. "You have been told this man," he pointed to Tak, "is a murderer. You were lied to." Ada stepped forward. "The man who lied to you," she said, her voice shaking but carrying, "is Captain Broderick. He claimed Silas Croft was rustling cattle at the time of his death, but I have a sworn medical record, on file with the federal office in Santa Fe, that proves Silas Croft was in my clinic at that exact time. I was treating him for a broken hand." "She is a liar," one of Broderick's men shouted. "Am I?" Ada's voice rose. "Then perhaps a photograph is not a liar." She held up the glass plate. "This is a photograph taken by this man, Herman. It shows Colonel Whitlaw's carriage and Captain Broderick at the abandoned water pump, the day Silas Croft was murdered, the same pump they used to steal his land." Herman stepped forward, his square beard jutting. "It is my picture, and I tell you, this woman," he pointed to Ada, "she saved my son's life. This man," he pointed to Tak, "he saved my family. They are not liars, they are heroes." The crowd was shifting, turning from Herman to Whitlaw, who looked, for the first time, uneasy. Then Tak stepped forward. He was breathing heavily, his side a universe of pain. He held up the W star nail. "The man who burned the clinic," Tak said, his voice a low growl. His horse wore this nail. He then held up the small, fire-blackened die. "I am a blacksmith. This is the tool that makes that nail. It is the W star, the mark of Whitlaw's men." Rios stepped down from the porch. "Captain Broderick, by the authority of the federal court, you are under arrest for the murder of Silas Croft and for conspiracy to commit land fraud." He unholstered his pistol. "Now, Marshal," Broderick said, his grin returning. "You are a fast man. I will give you that. But you are one man." "He is not one man," a voice cried. Reverend Eldridge, his face streaked with tears, stood in the church doorway. "He is with God. I have been a coward. I have been silent while evil walked my town. I was afraid of him." He pointed to Whitlaw. "No more, Marshal. What these people say is the truth. I have been silent, and my silence was a sin." The crowd roared. The dam of fear had broken. "It is over, Broderick," Rios said, leveling his gun. "He is not one man," Colonel Whitlaw said, his voice calm. He stepped off the boardwalk. "He is a federal officer." And in one fluid, horrifying motion, Whitlaw drew a polished derringer from his waistcoat and shot Marshal Rios in the chest. Rios looked down at his shirt, a small, dark circle appearing. He looked at Whitlaw, his eyes wide with surprise. Then he collapsed, his pistol clattering on the hard-packed dirt. The crowd screamed. It was a single, unified sound of terror. "It is over," Whitlaw said, his voice cold. His railroad rangers, who had been hidden on the rooftops, now stood up, their rifles aimed at the plaza. Broderick laughed, a short, barking sound, and drew his own pistol. "Grab the woman," Whitlaw commanded. "She is the only witness that matters now." Broderick lunged, seizing Ada before she could even react. He yanked her arm behind her back, pressing the hot muzzle of his gun to her temple. "Your justice is dead. Schoolmarm," he snarled, dragging her backward. Whitlaw and 2 rangers were already moving, using Ada as a human shield. "Burn the livery," Whitlaw shouted. "Cover our retreat." They were running toward the bluffs, toward the dark, rocky mouth of the canyon that loomed over the town. Takuma was on his knees. The sudden movement had torn his wound. He saw them take her. He saw the canyon, and his blood turned to ice. It was the Arroyo del Alma Perdida, the canyon of the lost soul, the place where he and his younger brother had been cornered by railmen years ago, the place where his brother had died, his last words a scream to run. Takuma staggered to his feet, a low groan of agony tearing from his throat. He saw his brother's face, the terror in his eyes. He heard the old, paralyzing memory. "Takuma, run!" He had run then. He was a boy, and he had run. "No," he whispered, a promise to the ghost in the canyon. "I am not running." He grabbed his knife from his belt. He ignored the fire in his side. He ignored the blood that was already soaking his bandages. He began to run, a staggering, lurching, but unstoppable pursuit. The sky, which had been threatening all day, finally broke. A clap of thunder, as loud as a cannon, shook the ground. The rain came, not as drops, but as a solid wall of water. He followed them into the canyon. The storm was a roaring, chaotic drumbeat. He found them at the suspension bridge, a rickety-looking thing of rope and old planks that swayed over a deep, black chasm. Broderick was halfway across, dragging Ada. Whitlaw and his men were on the far side, firing back at the town, which was a distant, confused noise. "Broderick!" Tok roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. But Broderick heard. He turned, shoving Ada to her knees on the swaying bridge. He raised his pistol, a black silhouette against the gray, driving rain. "I killed your brother in this canyon!" Broderick screamed, the wind carrying his voice. "He cried like a baby. Now I kill you!" He took careful aim. Tok was exposed, at the mouth of the bridge. "Tok, no!" Ada screamed. She was on her knees, the German's camera box still slung around her neck, its strap tough and unbroken. Broderick was too focused on his target. Ada's hands, numb and shaking, fumbled with the flashpan. She tore open the small, oiled skin bag of magnesium powder Herman had given her and poured it onto the pan. "Say goodbye, savage," Broderick shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ada lifted the camera, aimed it at his face, and triggered the flash. A blinding, chemical-white fume of light erupted in the dark. Rainy Canyon. It was brighter than the sun. A single, violent explosion of pure white. Broderick screamed. A high, panicked sound, firing his pistol wild as his vision was seared white. In that 1 second of blindness, Takuma was on the bridge. He was not a blacksmith. He was a Comanche warrior, and this was his land. He slammed into Broderick, a blur of wounded fury. The impact nearly tore the bridge from its moorings. They struggled, slipping on the wet, swaying planks, a dark chasm yawning beneath them. Tok's knife was in his hand. Broderick was blind, roaring, clubbing at him with a heavy pistol. Tok saw his chance. He got inside the wild swing, his left arm locking Broderick's gun hand. He had the knife to Broderick's throat. He saw his brother's face in the rain. He saw the terror. He saw Ada, huddled just feet away, her eyes wide. He did not cut. He transferred all his rage, his grief, and his strength into his right hand. He slammed his fist into Broderick's temple. It was a short, brutal, wooden sound. The man went limp, his pistol falling from his fingers and disappearing into the void. Tok caught him, his last bit of strength failing. He used the rope from the bridge railing itself, his hands, even in their agony, tying a series of knots that would not, could not, be broken. When they staggered back to the mouth of the canyon, the town was there. The rain was a deluge. Reverend Eldridge was there, holding a lantern. Herman and his sons were there, with shotguns. They had put out the fire in the livery, and, seeing Tuck run, they had followed. They saw Broderick, alive, unconscious, slung over Tuck's shoulder. A low growl rose from the men. "Get a rope!" Someone shouted from the back. "Hang him! Hang him now!" The crowd surged forward. Ada, her dress torn, her face bruised, stepped in front of Takuma, her arms spread wide. "No!" she shouted, her voice breaking but fierce, cutting through the storm. You will not become him." She pointed at the unconscious man. "We wanted the law. We did not get it. So we are the law, and the law does not murder. We will hold him. We will have justice." She locked eyes with the man who had called for the rope. Not revenge. The crowd stopped. The men looked at this small, drenched woman, at the bleeding Comanche warrior behind her, and they were, for the first time, ashamed. In the driving rain, under a sky that sounded like war drums, they formed a solemn procession. They were no longer a mob. They were a community, and they led their prisoner back to the small-town jail to wait for the storm to pass and for the new day to come. They put Broderick in the small, stone-built town jail, a box barely big enough for a man and his sins. Marshal Rios, pale and breathing in shallow, painful gasps, was laid out on the longest pew in the church, with Herman's wife tending his wound. The rest of the town, dazed and terrified, huddled in the church, a flock seeking a shepherd who had only just found his own voice. Ada and Takuma found their sanctuary in the barn behind the church. It was dry, filled with the sweet, dusty smell of old hay and the animal warmth of the minister's mule. The storm was a constant, drumming roar on the roof, a wild symphony for the world that had just been remade. Ada was shivering. It was not the cold. Though her dress was soaked through, it was the shock, a deep, cellular tremor that was the body's final admission of terror. She sat on a bale of hay, her arms wrapped around herself, her teeth chattering. Takuma was in his own universe of pain. He had barred the heavy barn door, then slid to the floor, his back against the rough wood. He was pale, his skin clammy in the flickering light of a single lantern. His breathing was shallow, a careful, measured intake of air that tried not to disturb the fire in his side. He watched her shiver. "You must get dry," he rasped. "The cold will take you. I cannot," she whispered. "I cannot stop shaking." He looked at the long, L-shaped tear in the shoulder of her dress, where Broderick had grabbed her. The fabric ripped away, exposing her skin to the cold. He pushed himself, with a low groan, to his knees. He crawled the few feet to where she sat. "My roll," he said, gesturing to his belt, which she had unfastened and laid beside him. She handed him the leather tool roll. He fumbled it open, his bloody fingers clumsy. He ignored the files and tongs. He found what he was looking for, a heavy, curved suture needle and a spool of thick, waxed thread, the kind he used for repairing saddle leather. "Turn," he commanded, his voice a whisper of authority. She, uncomprehending, obeyed. She turned her back to him, her shoulders trembling. He moved behind her. He could feel the cold radiating from her skin, with a gentleness that belied his scarred, rough hands. He took the torn edges of her dress and pulled them together. He was a blacksmith. He was a mender. He began to sew. His stitches were wide, but strong. Each pass of the needle was a deliberate, pained movement. He was mending her garment, stitching her back together, covering her, protecting her. The simple, repetitive act was the only thing holding either of them in the present. "I am alive," Ada whispered into the darkness of the barn, the sound of the rain a distant curtain. "I am only alive because you did not run." His hands paused. The needle hovered. He leaned his forehead against her back, his breath a warm spot on her cold, wet dress. He was exhausted. "I ran. Once." His voice was a low rumble, vibrates against her skin. My brother died. I promised, his ghost, I would not run again. He resumed his work, his hands moving more slowly. My oath, it was always for blood, to take life, I was afraid. He confessed, the words torn from him. Afraid to build a hearth, because my promise, it only brought death. Your promise brought life, she said, her voice breaking. She turned her head, trying to see him in the dark. It brought my life. You, Takuma, you are he who keeps the fire. She felt his hands still. He had finished. She turned on the hay bale to face him. He was kneeling before her, the lantern light carving deep shadows under his eyes, his cheeks. He looked like a man at the end of all things. She was desperate, not for a lover, but for a reason, for an anchor in the madness. She needed his promise, his fire, to be for life, for her, not for a ghost. Do not speak of ghosts, she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. She reached out, her shaking hands touching the sides of his face. She felt the stubble on his jaw, the surprising warmth of his skin. This is not a night for ghosts. This is for the living. Her eyes held his, a desperate, silent question. She needed him to claim this life, this moment, to bind himself to the living. Make me yours tonight. The words hung in the small, warm space between them. They were a plea, not for the flesh, but for the soul. A plea to be brought into his circle, his toman, to be his hearth, a plea to be safe. He did not speak. His eyes searched hers, and in their depths, he saw not a woman in need of saving, but a woman offering it. She was offering him a new oath, one of life. He raised his hands, his young Comanche fingers, scarred by the forge and stained with his own blood, did not tremble as he touched her face. They were a promise. They were gentle. They were fierce as the fire in the barn. The fire that makes, not destroys. He brushed the wet hair from her temple. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. It was a blacksmith's touch, solid, real, and incredibly warm. He leaned in, and the smell of hay and rain and iron and him filled her senses. He rested his forehead against hers, a profound, exhausted gesture of communion. He was alive. She was alive. They were, in this moment, the only two people in the world. The barn was silent, save for their shared breath and the drumming of the rain. The lantern burned low. After a long time, Ada pulled back, though her hands never left him. She reached to the chain around her neck. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. She pulled it free. Her old wedding band, cold and heavy, sat in her palm. She had worn it for 4 years as a widow, a shield against the world. She looked at it, then closed her hand. She did not throw it. She did not discard it. She reached into the small, waterlogged reticule at her feet, found her mother's small keepsake bag, and dropped the ring inside. It was a sound of finality, a small, muffled click. She was not forgetting her past. She was placing it, with honor, where it belonged. When she looked up, he was watching her. He understood. He reached into his own medicine pouch, a small, beaded bag that had not left his body. He pulled out a single, small, downy feather, tied with a string of cured sinew. My grandmother, he said, his voice raw. She gave this for the woman who would keep my hearth. He held it out to her. Ada, her hand still shaking, but for a different reason now, held out her wrist. He did not tie it. He opened her hand, palm up, and placed the small, fragile token in its center, a sign of ultimate trust. She closed her fingers around it. After this, she whispered, after justice, we will build it. Build what? He murmured, his strength failing. The forge, she said, and the school, together. He smiled, a true, unguarded smile that lit his face. A forge and a school. He leaned back against his bale of hay, his eyes closing. I will hold that promise. Ada sat beside him, not touching, but near. A new, calm warmth had settled over her, a strength that came from the inside. They sat in the quiet dark, two guardians of a new, fragile thing. The quiet was broken by a sound that was not the storm. A low whistle. From the plaza. Tak's eyes snapped open. He was a warrior again. He had his knife in his hand before Ada had even processed the sound. "What?" she whispered. "Whitlaw's men," he said. Then they heard it. Shouts, the crackle of fire, but not the storm's fire. The smell of kerosene. Again. Tak forced himself to his feet, a strangled cry of pain in his throat, and looked through a crack in the barn door. "The jail," he breathed, his voice sick. "They are burning the jail, with Broderick inside." "No," Ada said, her blood running cold. "Not justice. Not like that. They do not care," Tak said. "They are burning the town." Men were on the rooftops, firing. 3 of Whitlaw's rangers, left behind, were making a last, desperate, chaotic stand. Tak unbarred the door. Ada ran to the church, her voice screaming, "Fire, fire at the jail!" The bell. She had to ring the bell. She ran into the church, up the narrow stairs to the bell tower, and grabbed the rope. The heavy clang of the bell, which had first rung for justice, now rang for rescue. The town, which had been hiding, poured out, but this time, they were not a mob. They were a brigade. Herman and his sons, Reverend Eldridge, even Old Man Hemphill. They ran, not with ropes, but with buckets. Ada ran with them, back to the barn. She and Tak had to get the evidence. The photograph, the dye, the nail. They found them. But the barn was already catching. A ranger on the roof was throwing lit torches, trying to cover the escape. "No!" Ada screamed. As a torch landed on the hay bale where she had sat, they formed a line. Ada, Tak, Herman, the minister. They were not fighting Whitlaw. They were fighting the fire, in the center of the plaza, under the ringing bell. The whole town was working, passing buckets, dousing the flames on the jail and the barn. And then, in the smoky, chaotic light, Ada did the last thing she could. She walked to Takuma. He was leaning on a trough, his side bleeding again. But he was there. He was fighting. She took his hand, his bloody, sooty, blacksmith's hand. She held it up, in front of all of them, in front of the minister, in front of the town. "This," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the din, "is the man who saved us. This is the man who holds my oath." She did not know the rituals, but she knew what mattered. She knelt, scraped a circle in the wet mud and soot, and pulled him to it, a hearth circle. "Here," she said, "in the fire. We stand." The townspeople stopped, just for a second. They saw them, the schoolmarm and the Comanche, standing in a mud circle, hand in hand, in the middle of a burning town. The church bell rang out, a wild, joyous, terrible sound, the sound of a community being born. The fire at the jail was out. The 3 remaining rangers, cornered by a town that had finally found its spine, had surrendered. They were now in the cells their leader had just vacated. Broderick, his lungs full of smoke but his life intact, sat bound in the church, under the watchful, unforgiving eye of Herman and his shotgun. But the head of the snake was gone. Colonel Whitlaw had vanished in the chaos, his escape masked by the very fire he had ordered. Takuma stood by the muddy, chaotic plaza, the first light of a bruised dawn painting the sky. His side was a fresh, hot agony. Ada had rebandaged it, but the fight and the fire had cost him dearly. He pointed not to a man, but to the ground. "He is gone," Tak said, his voice a low rasp. The tracks were clear in the wet earth, a single, fine-bred horse, ridden hard, heading east, toward the new railroad line. "He will not get away," Ada said, her voice flat and cold. She was carrying the rifle she had taken from Rios's scabbard. "He has a train," a new voice said. They turned. Samuel Whitlock, his suit ruined, his face pale, sat on a horse in the middle of the street. He looked like a ghost. "He keeps a private engine at the transfer point," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "He thinks he can just leave. He thinks he can ride to Santa Fe and let the lawyers clean this up." Tak stepped forward, his hand on his knife. "I am not here to stop you," Samuel said, raising his hands. I am here to guide you. Why? Ada's voice was sharp. She had no trust left for this man. Because... Samuel looked down at his trembling hands. I am a witness, and I am tired of what I have seen. He is a murderer, and I am, God help me, a Whitlock. That name has to mean something more than this. He turned his horse. It is 10 miles. If he reaches that engine, he is gone forever. Tuck looked at Ada. He was in no condition to ride, but he gripped the saddle horn of his own horse, and with a grunt of pure, agonizing will, he pulled himself up. He would not fall. Not now. The three of them rode east. A strange, grim procession, the wounded warrior, the avenging teacher, and the repentant lawyer. They reached the transfer hub as the sky turned a familiar, sick yellow. A second storm was coming. The hub was not a station, it was a scar, a set of tracks, a water tower, and a long, high railroad trestle that spanned a dry, 1,000-foot-deep canyon. And on that trestle, a single, black-painted steam engine sat, beginning to hiss. He is there, Samuel breathed. They dismounted, moving to the cover of the rocks. Whitlaw was not alone. He had 2 men, his personal guards, who were frantically loading a small satchel onto the engine. Wait for the storm, Tuck rasped. Leaning against a boulder, he was bleeding again, but Whitlaw had seen them. Samuel, his voice, carried on the rising wind, was sharp and clear. You damn fool, you brought them. He raised a Spencer rifle. Kill them all. The 2 guards opened fire. The air was filled with the whine of ricochets. We are pinned, Ada said, her cheek pressed to the rock. He must not get on that train, Samuel said. He looked at Ada, at the fire in her eyes. He looked at Tuck, a man he had seen as a savage, who had more honor than he had ever possessed. Samuel! Whitlaw screamed again, as the wind began to howl, picking up sand. I will give you $10,000 in gold. It is in this satchel. Just kill them. Your name will be clear. Samuel looked at the engine. $10,000. A new life. No more. Colonel, Samuel shouted, his voice cracking. Your web is broken. He stood up from behind the rock. Not to fight, to be seen. You are a fool, Whitlaw screamed. He raised his rifle, aiming not at Samuel, but at Takuma, who was the more dangerous target. No, Samuel whispered. He saw the rifle swing. He saw the muzzle flash. He did not think. He lunged, shoving Takuma hard. The bullet, meant for Tuck's heart, struck Samuel in the shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out, a sharp sound of surprise, and crumpled to the ground. Samuel, Ada screamed. Tuck, driven by the other man's sacrifice, was on his feet. He grabbed his knife and ran, not at the train, but at the cover of the trestle's supports, disappearing under the tracks. The storm hit. It was not a storm. It was a solid, roaring wall of sand and grit. The world vanished in a brown, howling chaos. Ada was alone, Samuel bleeding at her feet. Whitlaw and his men hidden by the brown curtain. She could hear them, on the bridge, their boots clanging on the iron. They were coming for her. Tuck, she whispered, her rifle in her hand. She saw a shape, one of the guards, coming at her through the gloom. She fired. He screamed and fell. The other guard was firing from the engine. She looked at Samuel. He was conscious, his hand pressed to his shoulder. Go, he gasped. The satchel. Get the satchel. She looked at the trestle. Whitlaw was on the far side, hiding behind a heavy iron ore car that was sitting on a siding track. He was trapped, but he was armed. She moved, low and fast, through the blinding sand. She climbed onto the trestle. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear her from the earth. She saw Whitlaw. He was reloading, his face a mask of grit and fury. He saw her and raised his rifle. She fired, the shot going wild. He fired back, the bullet splintering the wood by her head. She was trapped. He was behind the heavy iron wall of the ore car. She could not hit him. She looked at the car. It was held in place by a single, heavy steel pin in the braking mechanism. She was a good shot. Her father had taught her to shoot, not men, but small targets, tin cans, knots in a rope. She braced herself against the railing. She raised her rifle. The wind was screaming. She could barely see. She aimed, not at the man, but at the pin. She breathed out, just as her father had taught her. She squeezed the trigger. The sound of the shot was lost in the storm. But she saw the pin, shattered, fly into the air. The heavy ore car, its brake released, began to roll. It moved slowly at first, then gathered speed on the slight incline. Whitlaw, realizing what had happened, scrambled out from behind it, his face a mask of terror. He was exposed. He looked at her, then stumbled back, away from the rolling car. His foot caught on a spike. He tripped, and he fell. He fell over the side of the high trestle. Ada screamed. He was not gone. He had caught a single crossbeam, and he was dangling, one-handed, his legs kicking over 1,000 feet of empty, roaring air. "Help me!" he shrieked, his voice a thin thread in the storm. "God, help me!" Ada ran forward, her rifle forgotten. A hand shot out from under the bridge, gripping the beam. Takuma. He had climbed the supports. He was under the trestle, his wounded body clinging to the ironwork. He saw Whitlaw, dangling just feet away. Whitlaw saw him. "Help me," he pleaded. "The satchel. It is yours. All of it. Help me." Tak looked at him. He saw the face of the man who had ordered the murder of Croft, the man who had burned Ada's home, the man who had, indirectly, caused his brother's death years ago. He had his knife in his hand. He could cut him loose. He could let him fall. It would be an end. Instead, he sheathed the knife. He reached out his hand, his left hand, the one with the red-painted nail. Whitlaw, sobbing, grabbed it. Tak grunted, the pain in his side a white-hot explosion. He was holding the full weight of the man. His wounded body was failing. "Justice," Tak grunted through clenched teeth, his arm shaking. "Not revenge." Ada was there, on her knees, reaching down. She grabbed Whitlaw's other arm. Together, the two of them, the woman he had tried to ruin and the man he had tried to hang, hauled Colonel Whitlaw, sputtering and weeping, back onto the safety of the bridge. He was a broken man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, animal terror. Tak pulled himself onto the deck, his body finally giving out. He collapsed, his blood a dark stain on the dusty planks. "The satchel," he breathed. Ada ran to the engine. It was there. She opened it. It was not gold. It was paper, ledgers, filled with names and numbers, bribes, payments, and underneath it all, a single, rolled-up piece of parchment. It was the original survey map, the true map of the Llano Estacado. They returned to Coyote Ford as the dust storm abated. They were a sight, Ada, driving a wagon. Samuel beside her, pale and bandaged, and in the back, Takuma, half-conscious, and Colonel Whitlaw, his hands bound, his eyes empty. They entered the plaza to a stunned silence. The townspeople were gathered at the church, where Reverend Eldridge was tending to the wounded. "He is alive," a voice said. Marshal Rios was sitting on the church steps, his chest wrapped in white linen, a cup of whiskey in his hand. The bullet, as it turned out, had struck the tin badge on his chest, deflecting just enough to miss his heart. "I am hard to kill," Rios gasped, a faint smile on his lips. He saw Whitlaw. His smile vanished. "Well," Rios said, "I see you brought my prisoner." He held out his hand, and Herman gave him a pen and a piece of paper. He scribbled, his hand shaking. It was a federal warrant. "Get him on the noon train, in chains. Get him out of my town." As Whitlaw was led away, a man in federal custody, Reverend Eldridge did not cheer. He turned, walked into his church, and began to ring the bell. It was not a ring of victory. It was a slow, measured toll, a prayer for the living, for the dead, and even for the damned. It was the sound of reconciliation. The town, in the afternoon light, began to heal. The people, who had only offered scraps in the dark, now came forward in the light. Herman and his sons, Their wagon staying brought lumber from a torn-down shed. "For the school," he said to Ada, "and the forge." Carl, the young photographer, gave Ada the camera. "You keep," he said. "It is the eyes of justice. It sees the truth." That evening, the first fire was lit. It was a small, temporary forge, built by Herman's sons, on the ashes of Tak's old smithy. Takuma was there, sitting on a cot, his wounds cleaned, his body broken but his spirit whole. Ada sat beside him, her hands, for the first time in days, not holding a weapon or a bandage. They watched the small fire. It was just a handful of coals, but Tak had thrown a pinch of his own mixture on it, and the sparks flew up, bright orange against the purple sky. They looked, Ada thought, like stars, not distant and cold, but born of the earth, rising, full of heat and promise. She looked at him. He looked at her. No words were needed. The hearth was lit. The dust of the second storm settled, but the air in Coyote Ford was permanently changed. It no longer tasted of fear, but of ash and opportunity. The legal machine, once set in motion, was grinding and inexorable. Marshal Rios, his arm in a sling and a permanent grimace on his face, stayed for a week. He was not a man for sentiment, but he was a man for paper. He oversaw the transfer of Colonel Whitlaw and Captain Broderick, both in heavy chains, to a federal wagon bound for Santa Fe. The two remaining rangers and the county registrar followed in a second. Less secure. Wagon. Their power was broken. Their reign of terror reduced to a stack of warrants. Samuel Whitlock, his shoulder professionally bandaged by Ada, his face a mask of pale resolve, went with them, not as a prisoner, but as the government's star witness. "Cousin," he had said to Ada, standing by the wagon, "I do not know if I can ever return to a place like this." "Then find a place you can—" "Samuel," Ada had said, not unkindly, "and make it better." He had nodded, looked at Takuma, and for the first time offered the blacksmith a look of genuine, profound respect. You are a better man than I am." Tak, his own side bandaged, merely nodded. "You are a man who tells the truth. That is enough." The wagons rolled out, and the town did not cheer. They watched, in a sober, silent acknowledgement, as the past was finally carted away. In the vacuum left by Whitlaw, a new, more fragile order began to emerge. The first, most pressing issue was water. With the railroad's false claim gone, the old tensions between the town's cattlemen and the Comanche bands, who used the high plains for seasonal hunts, returned. Reverend Eldridge called a meeting, not in his church, but in the open plaza, under the hard, blue sky. Ada was asked to attend. When she arrived, she saw Takuma was already there, standing beside a tall, weathered Comanche elder whose eyes seemed to hold the memory of the land itself. "They will not speak to us," Old Man Hemphill grumbled, "and we cannot understand them. I will speak," Tak said. Ada stepped forward, "and I will translate." It was a long, difficult afternoon. The cattlemen spoke of fences and ownership. The Comanche elder, his name One Who Remembers, spoke of passages, of seasons, of the buffalo's memory, and of water as a gift that belonged to no one. It was Ada who found the bridge. "He is not asking for the land," she said to the cattlemen, translating the elder's careful sign language and Tak's low-voiced explanations. "He is asking for a path, a single, defined path to the river, to be used only in the dry season. He is offering, in return, a promise not to hunt on this side of the arroyo. It is not a surrender, it is a treaty." She drew a line in the dirt. The cattlemen looked, they argued, but in the end, they saw the wisdom. A line on the earth, agreed upon, was better than a war. A new rule, a new understanding, was born. A few days later, Takuma rode out. His side was healing, but he rode with a stiff, pained grace. Ada, her heart in her throat, watched him go. He did not say where. He returned 2 days later, not alone. He was with One Who Remembers, and he was carrying a large, Flat stone. He rode past the town, to the mouth of the Arroyo del Alma Perdida. Ada, knowing, followed him. He took the stone to the high, windy place near the ruined bridge. It was the spot where his brother had fallen, so many years ago. It was the place where Broderick had boasted, and where he had been defeated. Teakuma placed the stone. It was a simple, unmarked monument, a grave for a ghost. He stood for a long time, his back to her. Then, from the town, two figures approached. It was Reverend Eldridge, his Bible in his hand, and Lina, the young Navajo girl who had, after her rescue, refused to leave Ada's side. They were not alone. One who remembers, the elder, walked with them. They gathered at the stone. It was not planned. It was a thing that simply happened. Eldridge opened his Bible. He read the 23rd Psalm, his voice no longer thin and frightened, but full and resonant in the high, clear air. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. When he was finished, he closed the book and nodded to the elder. One who remembers stepped forward. He lit a small bundle of sweetgrass, the scent sharp and clean in the wind. He spoke, not in English, not in Comanche, but in the old, liturgical language of his ancestors. He was not reading from a book. He was reading from the land, the sky, the wind. Ada did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. It was a blessing, a release, a prayer of safe passage for a soul long trapped. Teakuma, who had been standing, slowly knelt. He placed his hand on the stone. He had come to the canyon to face his past. He was leaving, finally, at peace. The work of building began. It was hard, slow work. Herman and his sons, who had decided to stay and open a freight business, were the heart of it. They helped clear the rubble of Tuck's old smithy. They helped raise the new beams. The new building was larger. It was two buildings, joined in the center. On one side, the dark, hot, ringing heart of the forge. On the other, the light, quiet, hopeful heart of the school. Tuck, though his side still pained him, was a man reborn. He was a teacher. He taught Herman's sons, Carl and young Peter, how to swing a hammer, how to read the heat of the iron, how to make not just horseshoes, but the tools of a new life, plowshares, hinges, well fittings. Ada, in her half of the building, taught as well. She taught Lina, who now lived with her in a small room behind the school, and the other children of the town. She taught them their letters, their numbers, and their history. Not the history of kings, but the history of their own town, the history of the past 2 weeks. She taught them what courage looked like. Lina, quiet and observant, became her assistant. She was a natural healer, her hands gentle with the younger children, her knowledge of herbs, learned from her own grandmother, astonishing Ada. They were, in their way, a family. A letter arrived from Santa Fe. It was from Samuel. He was alive. He was well. His testimony, along with the ledgers, had been explosive. The county registrar was in prison. The railroad was facing a federal investigation that was shaking its very foundations. He was not coming back. He wrote, going to find a place, as she had suggested. But enclosed was a bank draft for $300. Atonement, he had written at the bottom, for the school, and for the forge. The old church bell, the one that had rung for justice and rescue, was cracked. The fire in the tower had been too hot, the dousing with cold water too sudden, Reverend Eldridge lamented. It is the voice of the town, and it is broken. No, Teakuma said. He had come to inspect it. It is not broken. It is ready. He would not let them send for a new one. He and Herman's sons built a special pit, a foundry, behind the new forge. They melted the old bell down, its bronze heart a pool of liquid fire. But Takuma added something. He forged a series of interlocking steel rings, made in his own forge, from the fine steel Samuel's money had bought. The bronze is soft, he explained to Ada. It rings sweet, but the steel is strong. It will hold the new sound. It will not crack. They poured the new bell, the hot bronze flowing around the steel skeleton. When it was cooled, and hoisted back into the tower. Tuck himself had chiseled a new line of words into its rim. Just above the old date, it read, "Justice rings kinder." The town came together to inaugurate the new building. It was not a party. It was a ceremony. Takuma, in a clean shirt, his hair tied back, lit the first fire in the new forge. It was a bright, hot, smokeless flame. He carried a burning brand from that fire to the hearth in the schoolroom and lit the first fire there. Then he led them outside. In the space between the forge and the school, he had laid a perfect circle of stones. "The toman, the hearth circle. This," he said, his voice quiet but carrying, "is the center." He and Ada stepped inside. One who remembers, who had come for the ceremony, began a low, soft chant. Then Ada spoke. "This is a place for all of us," she said, "a place of making and a place of learning. But it is a promise that no one will be an outcast here, a promise that the fire in our hearts will be used to build, not to burn." Reverend Eldridge stepped forward. "In my faith," he said, "we lay a cornerstone." Hermann, his beard combed, stepped forward. "In my home, we break bread." Takuma picked up a small, smooth river stone from a pile he had gathered. "In my family," he said, "we place a handstone, a stone to hold the memory, a promise that this hearth will be safe." He placed his stone in the center of the circle. Ada placed one beside it. Then Lina, then the minister, and Herman, and Carl, and Old Man Hemphill, and Mrs. Prentice, one by one. Every person in Coyote Ford came forward, took a stone, and placed it in the circle, a small, growing monument to a new compact. Later that night, the fires were banked. The town was asleep. Ada stood in the new forge, the smell of the new fire still warm. Tuck was there, cleaning his tools, his movements slow, methodical. He was still in pain, but he was home. She came up behind him. She did not touch his side, but she touched his hand, the one that had held the file, the one that had pulled her from the fire, the one that had held Whitlaw from the abyss. It was a map of scars. One, a silvery white line, ran from his knuckle to his wrist. "This one," she said, her voice soft, "is new." He turned his hand over, looking at the scar as if seeing it for the first time. "No," Takuma said. He smiled, a slow, tired smile. "It is not a scar. It is a new line on my palm. It changes the future." He closed his hand, his fingers, strong and sure, enveloping hers. The seasons turned, and the land, scarred by fire and greed, began to heal. Autumn painted the high plains in hues of rust and gold. Takuma's side, which had been a map of agonizing pain, healed into a long, silvered scar. He wore it not as a wound, but as a reminder. The town of Coyote Ford, no longer huddled in the shadow of the railroad's power, began the slow, hard work of becoming a community. The forge and the school, built side by side from shared lumber and a new, shared hope, stood as the town's twin centers, a spine of iron and intellect. They chose a day when the sky was a high, piercing blue, the air so clear it felt like a promise. Their wedding was not one event, but two, a weaving of the worlds they had come from. It began at the toman, the hearth circle, built of stones from every hand in the town, was swept clean. One who remembers, the Comanche elder whose wisdom had guided their treaty, came and lit the central fire. He did not come as a priest, but as a witness, his presence a blessing that rooted them to the land itself. He lit a braid of sweetgrass, and the smoke, clean and sharp, rose in a single, thin column. He spoke in his language, a low, rhythmic telling of the earth, the fire, and the family. Takuma did not wear a suit. He stood in a clean linen shirt, his hide vest, and the new leather boots Herman had given him. He was a blacksmith, a maker, and he stood by the fire he had lit. Ada did not wear a white veil. She wore a dress of a deep, strong blue, the color of the horizon after a storm. Lina, her face alight with a joy that was almost fierce, stood beside her, holding a small, carved wooden box. Takuma had no ring of gold. Gold was a metal he did not respect. It was soft, and it drove men mad. He had spent 3 nights at the forge, working in secret. He stepped forward and took Ada's left hand. From his pocket, he produced a small, dark object. It was a ring, forged from the same bar of hard steel he had used for the bell's new frame. He had hammered it thin, polished it with fine sand until it shone like a black star, and chiseled a single, tiny, straight line into its surface. "It is a new line," he said, his voice low. "For her alone. To change the hand, to change the future." He slid it onto her 4th finger. It was heavy. It was real. It was a promise of strength. Ada, in turn, did not offer him metal. She nodded to Lina, who opened the small box. Inside, on a bed of soft rabbit fur, was the small, downy feather he had given her in the barn. She had taken it. She had bound its quill not in sinew, but in the brightest blue thread from her own sewing kit, the color of her dress, the color of the sky. She took the small talisman. "You gave me a sign of your grandmother's hearth," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I give you the promise of ours." She did not put it on his hand. She tied the blue-bound feather to the leather thong around his neck, where it came to rest beside his own medicine pouch. A new oath, joined with the old, one who remembers chanted a final, low word. They clasped hands across the fire. It was done. Then, the bell began to ring. It was the new bell. The sound was not the rusty clang of fear, nor the toll of death. It was a deep, resonant, and complex sound. The bronze harmony held firm by the steel skeleton within. Justice rings kinder. The sound carried across the plaza, and the entire town was waiting on the steps of the church. They walked from the hearth circle, hand in hand, the dust of the plaza on their boots. Reverend Eldridge stood at the top of the steps, his Bible in his hand. He was not pale. He was not frightened. His face was weathered, and he was smiling. "We have seen the promise of the hearth," he announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We have seen the promise of the earth. Now, we bear witness to the promise of the law and of God." He did not read the passages of obedience. He read from the book of Ecclesiastes. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. He looked at the 2 of them. "Takuma, Ada, you have lifted up this town. You have lifted up each other." He did not ask for other rings. He asked for their hands. They raised their joined hands, the black steel on her finger, the feather at his throat. "By the authority of God and the witnessed consent of this community," Eldridge declared, "I pronounce you man and wife. You are the keepers of this town's heart. Takuma, you may kiss your bride." Takuma, a man who had faced down gunmen, who had walked through fire, looked, for a single, fleeting second, profoundly shy. He turned to Ada. The crowd was a blur. There was only her. He cupped her face in his scarred, warm hands. He did not kiss her with the fire of the barn. He kissed her with the steady, enduring warmth of the forge. It was a kiss of promise, a kiss of arrival, a kiss that tasted of soot and soap and the rest of their lives. The town cheered, the sound a wave of joy that rolled across the plains. The next day, they hung the sign. Carl, the young photographer, had offered to paint a grand sign with pictures of anvils and books. Takuma had shaken his head. He had forged the sign himself, a large, flat rectangle of dark iron. Ada, with a small pot of white paint, had lettered the words herself. They were simple, stark, and true. They hung it on the heavy crossbeam that joined the school to the forge. It read, "Forge and School," and underneath, in smaller, careful letters, "Keepers of the Hearth." Their first shared act as a married couple was not a honeymoon. It was a trip to the newly established county office, where a sober man, sent by Marshal Rios, now sat, Takuma and Ada, along with one who remembers an old man Hemphill, stood before the registrar's desk. They unfurled not a deed of sale, but a map. The path to the river, the one Ada had drawn in the dirt, was formally registered. It was not deeded to the Comanche. It was not deeded to the town. It was deeded as public trust land, a permanent right-of-way for any man or animal. Its use to be governed by the seasons. As the treaty dictated, it was the first law the town had written for itself. It was not a fence to keep people out. It was a path to let people through. Winter came, and the world grew quiet. The forge was the loudest, warmest thing in town. Its rhythmic clang, 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 a new and steady heartbeat. The school was a hum of voices. Lina, now Ada's full-time apprentice, helping the younger German children sound out their English words. One afternoon, as the snow fell softly outside, Ada sat at her desk. She was not writing in a medical ledger. She was writing a letter. It was to a former student, a girl whose family had fled west to the coast, seeking a gentler world. "Dear Elspeth," she wrote, the pen scratching in the quiet room. "You asked me in your last letter if there is any safety to be found in this hard land. I have thought on this for a long time. I used to believe the law was merely a weapon, a club used by the strong to beat the weak. I have learned it is not. The law is a tool, like a hammer. It can be used to shatter, or it can be used to build." She looked out the window, across the few feet of snow, to the forge. She could see her husband's shadow moving against the orange glow. "We are building, Elspeth," she continued. "We have a new bell, and its sound is kinder than the old. We have a forge that makes plowshares, not just pistols. We have a hearth circle built of stones from every hand. It is not an easy place. This is still the West. It is hard, but it is, for the first time in my memory, truly free." She paused, then dipped the pen again. "Come to the edge of freedom. Elspeth, if you are tired of running, come and help us build. The law here is, at last, healthier than the sound of a gunshot." That night, the snow turned to rain. A soft, drumming sound on the roof. The old barn behind the church, the one that had been their first sanctuary, was repaired. It was where Tak now stored his iron and the good, dry wood for his forge. They were there, not sleeping, just sitting. They sat on a bale of hay, in the same spot where he had mended her dress, in the same spot where she had pleaded for his promise. But now, there was no fear, no desperation. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He was solid. He smelled of iron and smoke and the clean scent of the rain. He was not a warrior. He was not a target. He was her husband. He wrapped his arm around her, his hand calloused and familiar, finding hers in the dark, their fingers interlaced. They did not speak. They did not need to. They sat, two quiet figures, listening to the rain on the roof, the sound of a world at peace. It was a promise of a life to be lived not in the thunder of high drama, but in the steady, shared quiet of every day. In their small room behind the school, the fire in the hearth stove burned low. On the wooden mantel, Ada had placed a small, tin box. It was full of seeds. Seeds for the spring garden she would plant with Lina. Corn, beans, squash. The three sisters, the food of this land, a promise of a future, of planting, not just surviving. And above the door, Takuma had hung a carving. It was not a charm against evil. It was a piece of smooth, pale cottonwood. He had carved into it the simple, clear outline of a hand, palm forward, the shape he had left in the soot, the hand of rescue, the hand that builds. He had told her, not the hand that breaks. The day's light was fading. The air was cold, clean after the rain. The town was finishing its work. Old man Hemphill was locking the livery. Herman was closing his freight office, his sons loading the last wagon. Then, the sound came. It rang out over the plaza, clear and strong in the cold, twilight air. The new bell. It was not an alarm for fire. It was not a call to trial. It was not a toll for the dead. It was 6 o'clock. Ada, standing on the schoolhouse porch, her hand on the rope, had rung it. It was the sound of supper. Takuma, in his forge, heard it. He smiled. He put down his hammer. He banked his fire for the night, the coals glowing like sleeping hearts. He washed his hands and face in the water bucket. The cold water a welcome shock. He walked across the small, open space. No longer a battlefield, just a yard. He walked toward the woman waiting on the porch, toward the light in the window, toward the smell of coffee and baked bread. In the West, freedom was not a thing that fell from the sky. It was not a gift. It was a thing that had to be made. It had to be forged, with every swing of a hammer, with every hard-fought word of truth, and with every deliberate, daily choice to hold on to one's own humanity. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from. Let us know in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you enjoyed it, please support us by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.